Hi everyone, I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director for the New York Times. We're pleased to have Bill Keller, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, op-ed columnist, and senior writer for the New York Times with us. He formerly served as the executive editor of the Times. As a leader, you will often have to make tough decisions. This is one of the biggest challenges of leadership. So today, Bill's going to discuss his thoughts on decision making, and we welcome all of you to join the conversation. Simply type your questions into the space provided. So with that, welcome, Bill.
Thank you. I should probably say up front that as an op-ed columnist, the only person that I have to lead anymore is myself. And the main decision I make every week is what to write about, and I guess who to call to get some opinions on the subject and information on the subject that I'm going to write about. But I did spend 8 years as the editor of the Times, and I have thought a bit about, what leadership means. I'm not ready to write a textbook on it, but it seems to me that leadership is mostly about balance. It's about balancing different things. You want the people who work for you to come up with fresh, original ideas, but you've got to balance that with practicalities. What can you afford? What's really likely to work? You want to hold the people who work for you accountable. You want to make sure that you have a way of measuring whether they're being successful or not. But on the other hand, you don't want to micromanage everything either, because that way you can waste all your time worrying about little things. You want to build consensus. It's really important to listen to what the different points of view among the people who work for you. That's, most good ideas come from other people. But you can't let that paralyze you. If you spend all of your time listening and trying to get everybody to agree, nothing ever gets decided. And there are always lots more reasons not to decide something than to decide them. I mean, once you've made a decision, you've possibly hurt somebody's feelings. Somebody will feel left out, somebody will be angry, and the decision might be wrong, so you're going to be tested once you've decided something. But if you don't decide, then you have a situation that looks a lot like the US Congress these days, where nothing gets done because nobody's willing to bend, and nobody in the leadership is willing to make a concrete decision. The other main balancing that you have to do is a balancing of constituencies, and that will vary depending on what kind of work you're doing, what kind of institution you do it in. But as an editor of a newspaper, you're worried about readers first and foremost, giving them the best product you can. You have a staff that you have to take care of. You have the institution, meaning the business, what everybody these days calls the brand, that you have to watch out for. That's a constituency too. And last but not least, and this always sounds a little vague, but I think is a real thing, there's the public interest. I mean, sometimes you really are considering whether doing a particular story and the way that you do it is going to affect the general public. And we place a premium on that. So some decisions will only touch one or two constituencies, and they may be fairly simple. One that comes up a lot when you're the editor of a newspaper these days is reporter X wants a leave of absence to write a book. For some reason that's completely mysterious to me, reporters all want to write books. I've tried a couple of times and found the process miserable, and I generally try to talk people out of writing books, but they insist on doing it anyway. And so you've got, on the one hand, if a reporter goes on a leave of absence to write a book, that's one less reporter that you have to do the work. Somebody else has to do their work for them. You have to figure out who that other person's going to be, how much disruption to the whole coverage of the news there's going to be. On the other hand, giving somebody a book leave, particularly a really good journalist who's done a great job, is a way of strengthening their loyalty and devotion to the paper. You give them a year off to go write their book. Regardless of how the book comes out, they're going to be grateful, and they will probably repay you in harder work, smarter work down the road. Some decisions are a lot more complicated than that. I'll give you a couple of examples that are particularly dramatic, although obviously most days these are not the kind of decisions that editors have to make. On several occasions while I was executive editor, we had reporters who were kidnapped or injured in the line of duty, particularly covering wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had one reporter who was kidnapped by the Taliban for 7 months. That becomes kind of the center of your whole world when it happens, because obviously you're concerned about the reporter. You're also concerned about the morale and the anxiety level of the other staff, concerned about family who are, I can guarantee you, almost certainly freaking out. You're concerned about what are the institutional responsibilities, what should we do and what should we not do. The Times, for instance, has a policy that we don't pay ransom for people who are kidnapped. Well, that makes it very tricky to negotiate with somebody who's taken one of your reporters prisoner. So you have to deal with that. Actually, the first decision that you have to make in a situation like that is, this is a news story. A reporter for the New York Times has been kidnapped by the Taliban. Do you tell that story, or is there reason to maybe sit on that story for a little while you try to figure out what's going on? Will you put the reporter in danger if everybody around the world suddenly announces, oh my God, a reporter for the New York Times has been kidnapped? The other example I'll give you, which comes up more often than you might think, although not usually in a terribly dramatic way, is the question of publishing or not publishing information that has classified material in it, secrets in it. Back in 2004, to just give you one example, a couple of reporters for the Times learned that the National Security Agency was eavesdropping on Americans without getting a legal warrant to do that. Obviously a big story, but the government argued very passionately that if we disclosed this fact, it would be useful information for terrorists to have. They would immediately start using other forms of communication to plot their attacks on the U.S. or U.S. interests. We had to decide, first of all, I said initially this is all about balancing, and in that case the balance is, on the one hand, the importance of this information to the public, which people need information to hold their government accountable. Is this something they might want to know so that they can decide whether they approve of it? On the other hand, is there a danger to national security? Would we put lives at risk if we publish this information? In that particular case, it took almost a year of gathering additional information, reassuring ourselves that we wouldn't put people in danger before we actually published the story. Most of the time, the decisions are much easier than that, but that basic trade-off between the public's right to know and the government's responsibility to keep secrets forces us to make decisions like that more frequently than you might think. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, great. There's a question. So you talked about the classified information in 2004 and your decision, how it took over a year to publish it. It's really thoughtful decision making, but what if you don't have time to make a quick decision? What do
you don't have time to drag on for a year?
Exactly, and think about it.
Well, in most cases, you don't have that much time. I mean, particularly on these published or not published decisions, it's often, a decision that you want to make before a deadline in one day. I always try to make it a policy, particularly if the stakes are very high. I mean, if you're talking about a life or death situation, then you can't rush into it just because you have a deadline to put the paper to the printing, send the paper to the printing press. If the stakes are lower, then you can obviously afford to make a quicker decision. But a lot depends on what's at stake.
Great. Okay, we have another question. In making personal decisions on hiring, do you hire on performance or potential? What do you look for?
Well, it's pretty hard to separate performance from potential, because the only way that you can really judge how good somebody is going to get is by seeing how fast they've grown into the work that they've already done. But I mean, if I have to choose, I guess I give more weight to potential than to performance, because sometimes you'll get people who have a great track record, but if you look at it closely, you see that they've kind of lost energy towards the end of their time, that they may be, went on an upward slope, but now they're on a downward slope, and you don't want to hire somebody who's kind of into the coasting stage of their career. You want to hire people who really have an upside.
Drive. Okay, another question's coming in. Say that you are a former leader in a non-leadership role. What can you do to give your wisdom without taking control?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think you try to be humble and maybe withhold a little bit. It's not very effective to give your wisdom to people if they aren't going to listen to it. And they're not going to listen to it if you're acting superior or acting as if you know better than whoever has the job now. So gently is, I guess, the short answer, the one-word answer to your question.
Okay, the next question we have, how is the executive editor's decision-making made more difficult now that the 24/7 interactive news cycle accelerates?
That is a really good question, because everything is sped up. And so a lot of times an editor's job is to slow things down. It used to be that we had a deadline or 2 deadlines or 4 deadlines in the evening for different editions of the paper, and that was it. Now the deadline is right now, and then the next deadline is right now, and the next deadline is right now. And you're competing with other news organizations that are similarly wired for 24/7 news cycle. There is a premium on being first.
But also getting it right.
But getting it, well, there have been some really embarrassing instances lately of people getting things wrong. A number of news organizations, after the Boston Marathon bombing, distributed pictures of people that were said to be suspects who it turned out were not suspects at all. And there have been a number of other cases like that. In the Newtown shooting, a number of people used the name of the brother of the shooter instead of the name of the shooter. I think in the long run, those kinds of mistakes cost you a lot more than being 5 minutes later with the story. If you have to choose, obviously you want to be first and right. But if you have to choose, it's much more important, especially for a place like the Times, which has a reputation to hold up. It's much more important to be right.
Great. Okay, the next question. Did you have a mentor when you started? If yes, who was it?
Not when I started, but when I started in journalism, well, I guess I sort of did. My first job, which was right out of college at a paper called the Portland Oregonian, there was an assistant city editor named Dick Johnson who was my boss and I guess a mentor. But I moved around a lot to different beats, different assignments, different news organizations. If I had a mentor at the Times, it was probably Joe Lelyveld, although he didn't really become, that until I went on the foreign staff after I'd been here a few years.
Great, thank you. In your worldview, who are the leaders who seem to be getting it right on decisions?
There are some weeks when I would say Obama, and there are some weeks I would say not Obama. He's had a very tricky time, and he's had so much to deal with that it's hard not to feel some sympathy for how impossible it is to. He can make a decision, but he can't then act on it without a lot of other people supporting him. I have to say there's nobody in particular who comes to mind as a world leader who is getting it right. I mean, it pains me to say this because he's not somebody I particularly admire, but somebody who has turned out to be a very shrewd and opportunistic decision maker is Vladimir Putin in Russia. The latest example of that is, he saw the opportunity to propose a plan to disarm Syria of its chemical weapons, which made him a peacemaker in the eyes of the world, accomplish something that he wanted to accomplish, but also stop dead in its tracks any talk of America intervening in Syria, where Russia is supporting the government. So he accomplished about 3 or 4 things at once and put Obama in a trap. And I don't particularly approve of his authoritarian style of leadership, but at least in that case, he was on it.
That's true. Okay, the next question. How often do you need to bring your legal team into the fold regarding editorial decisions?
Pretty rarely. We bring in the legal team if if a story is particularly sensitive and we figure there might be legal action. We want to make sure that we've covered all our bases. So in investigative projects, for example, we call it being lawyered. We'll often have an investigative story lawyered. In the case of a number of the stories that we've written that were based on classified information, although we're pretty familiar with the legal ground involving the free press, we will often bring a lawyer in for those. But that's, on a typical day, the executive editor doesn't see the lawyers. It's only on particularly sensitive stuff.
Okay. Are decisions of a leader accepted even when it goes against the organization? Is honesty a big part in the qualities of a journalist?
Are decisions accepted? Well, I used to say that that newsrooms are the kind of organizations that have an ambient level of discontent. People who go into journalism tend to be skeptical. They do not hold their tongue when they see something that they think is wrong. So you get a lot of pushback, and I think that's mostly good. I would much rather work in an organization where some days you wear yourself out sort of defending your decision than in a place where everybody just fell into place, and even though they had possibly thoughtful complaints or criticisms of what you decided to do, kept them to themselves.
Okay, another question. Are there any decisions that the New York Times editorial board makes by consensus, or are they made by a select few? Could you give us an example of a consensus-based decision that you have already made?
We've got to be a little clearer about terminology. There is a thing called, there's a division at the Times between the news, which is the newsroom, which I ran for 8 years, which is the reporters and photographers and graphic artists and stuff who do news. And then there's the opinion side, where I work now as a columnist, and there is an editorial board there, but columnists don't sit on it. It's a group of, I don't know, a dozen or 15 people who write the editorials, mostly unsigned editorials that are just sort of the collective wisdom of the editorial board. I believe that they mostly work by consensus, but I'm not in the room, and it's as mysterious to me as it is to you.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. How relevant are journalism schools in today's changing climate?
I think the good journalism schools are more relevant than they've ever been. I did not go to journalism school, and I grew up in a sort of tradition that said, well, the thing you do is you get a job at a small newspaper, and some experienced older editor takes you under his wing and shows you the ropes, and then you move up to a bigger newspaper and a bigger newspaper, and you learn on the job. But now all those grizzled old veterans have been given buyouts, or their newspapers have been closed underneath them. There aren't as many small local newspapers, regional newspapers to do the training. So the burden is on journalism schools is much more important now than it's ever been. And I know a lot of them are going through a period of kind of re-examination of their mission to make sure that they're, keeping on top of all the things that are changing thanks to the digital world.